Halloween is the one night we celebrate fear as entertainment. We build haunted houses and tell ghost stories, all from a position of perfect safety. The 10 people in this video, however, decided to skip the safety part. They tried to become the main character in their own horror story, and reality was happy to provide a tragic ending. Disclaimer: monsters aren't real, but stupidity is. 1. In the fiercely competitive world of suburban Halloween one-upmanship, a man named Frank was not just a participant, he was a reigning champion. Every year, his home transformed into a full-scale, Hollywood-level haunted attraction, a spectacle that drew crowds from neighboring towns. This year, Frank was determined to create his magnum opus. He was obsessed with achieving one specific Holy Grail effect: a thick, dense, ground-hugging fog that would turn his entire property into a scene from a classic Gothic horror film. He'd experimented with cheap, glycol-based fog machines, but found their output to be thin, pathetic, and smelling vaguely of burnt sugar. Frank was a man of science, a DIY purist who believed that with enough research and a blatant disregard for warning labels, he could engineer a far superior solution. His research led him to the beautiful, simple, and terrifyingly efficient science of dry ice. He learned that when solid carbon dioxide is submerged in hot water, it sublimates at an exponential rate, creating a massive volume of dense, heavy fog. His plan was a masterpiece of scale and a catastrophic failure of risk assessment. He wasn't going to use a mere bucket. He was going to create the ultimate industrial-grade fog generator. His chosen vessel, his large, heated indoor jacuzzi, located in a glass-walled sunroom he designated as the mad scientist's lab portion of his haunted house. He ordered a 50-pound commercial-grade block of dry ice. On the night of his annual Halloween bash, with the first guests moments away, Frank began his grand performance. The jacuzzi was steaming, the water a perfect 104 degrees Fahrenheit. With the triumphant grin of a mad genius about to unleash his creation, he heaved the massive smoking block of frozen gas into the hot water. The reaction was instantaneous and more spectacular than he could have ever imagined. The sunroom was immediately engulfed in a roiling, boiling cloud of pure white fog. It cascaded over the sides of the jacuzzi, a ghostly, silent waterfall that spread across the floor, a perfect, ankle-deep river of mist. It was perfect. He stood in the middle of the room, a silhouette in the swirling vapor, admiring his handiwork, completely oblivious to the silent, invisible, and incredibly efficient killer he had just unleashed. What Frank's enthusiastic but incomplete research had failed to teach him is that dry ice is not frozen water. It is frozen carbon dioxide. As the 50-pound block sublimated in the hot water, it wasn't releasing harmless water vapor. It was pumping an enormous, overwhelming volume of pure CO2 gas into the room. In an open, well-ventilated space, this would have harmlessly dissipated. But in his sealed, poorly ventilated sunroom, the heavy, odorless, colorless gas was rapidly displacing every last molecule of breathable oxygen, starting from the floor up. Frank, standing ankle-deep in his creation, was the first to fall victim. He wouldn't have felt a thing. The first symptom of oxygen deprivation isn't a struggle to breathe. It's a gentle, almost pleasant lightheadedness, a wave of euphoria he likely mistook for the thrill of success. Then, as the oxygen level in his blood plummeted below the critical threshold, he simply and quietly lost consciousness, collapsing into the very fog he had so proudly created, a final, permanent prop in his own haunted house. 2. The quiet, tree-lined streets of a peaceful suburb are a battleground of unspoken rivalries, fought with meticulously manicured lawns and passive-aggressive holiday decorations. For two neighbors, Dave and Gary, this Cold War was a year-round affair. Dave was a quiet, detail-oriented man who valued order and subtlety. Gary was a loud, boisterous hunter who saw the world as a place to be conquered, his prize-winning taxidermy a testament to his prowess. This Halloween, Dave, a master of the long con prank, decided it was time to declare checkmate. His plan was a work of psychological art, designed to strike at the very core of his neighbor's macho identity. He knew Gary was perpetually paranoid about bears and other predators wandering onto his property from the adjacent woods. So, Dave decided to bring Gary's greatest fear to life. He invested a small fortune in a custom-made, hyper-realistic werewolf costume. This wasn't a cheap plastic masked getup. It was a full-body, articulated animatronic suit created by a special effects artist, complete with realistic fur, glowing red eyes, and a snarling servo-driven jaw. It was a masterpiece of manufactured terror. Dave's plan was simple. Wait for Gary's nightly ritual of enjoying a cigar on his back porch, then emerge from the woods, a 7-foot-tall, snarling beast of pure nightmare fuel. On Halloween night, the stage was perfectly set. A full moon hung in the sky. Dave, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilarating anticipation, slipped into the heavy, claustrophobic suit and crept through the woods. He saw the glowing cherry of Gary's cigar. It was showtime. Taking a deep, ragged breath through the mask's hidden air holes, he let out a guttural, pre-recorded roar and burst from the tree line. The effect was everything he had hoped for and more. Gary leapt to his feet, the cigar falling from his open mouth, his face a perfect mask of abject terror. But Dave's meticulously planned prank had a fatal, overlooked variable. He had predicted Gary's flight response. He had catastrophically failed to account for the fight. Gary was a hunter. His deeply ingrained instinctual reaction to a perceived mortal threat was not to run, but to neutralize it. In a single, fluid, and horrifyingly efficient motion, he dropped back into his house and re-emerged a split second later with the high-powered hunting rifle he always kept ready by the door. Dave, still in character and high on the success of his prank, probably saw the rifle and thought, "He's really selling it. This is perfect." He raised his prosthetic claws and took another menacing step forward. To Gary, in the dim light, his adrenaline-flooded brain screaming, "Predator," this was not a prank. It was a charge. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, looked through the scope, saw only the center mass of a large, aggressive beast, and fired. The werewolf costume, for all its visual realism, offered zero ballistic protection. Dave's perfectly executed prank had worked a little too well. He had been so obsessed with creating a convincing monster that he had succeeded in convincing the one man in his neighborhood with the means, the motive, and the mindset to kill one. 3. In the fiercely competitive, testosterone-fueled world of amateur haunted house creators, a man named Tom was a bona fide legend. Every Halloween, his suburban garage transformed into a labyrinth of terror that was the envy of the entire neighborhood. This year, Tom was determined to transcend legend and become a god. He was going to create a haunted house so viscerally, terrifyingly realistic that it would be spoken of in hushed, reverent tones for generations. The grand finale, the bloody crescendo of his symphony of fear, was to be the Chainsaw Maniac Attack. Tom was a purist, a craftsman who believed that true horror lay in authenticity. The fake plastic chainsaws from the party store, with their pathetic, tinny buzzing sounds, were an insult to his art. He decided that for his final scene to have the gut-punching impact he desired, he needed the real thing. He went to his tool shed and retrieved his actual gas-powered chainsaw. It was a heavy, powerful, and genuinely lethal tool. He stood there for a moment, considering. His original, slightly safer plan was to remove the cutting chain, but as he looked at it, he felt a pang of artistic compromise. The terrifying rattle of a real chain, the glint of light on the sharp teeth. That was true horror. He decided to leave it on. "I'll be careful," he promised himself, the 4 most famous last words in the Darwin Awards lexicon. On Halloween night, his haunted house was a smashing success. Group after group of terrified teenagers stumbled out into the night, screaming with the kind of delighted horror that was music to his ears. The final group of the night entered the garage. Tom, hidden in a specially constructed alcove, took a deep breath and pulled the starter cord. The chainsaw roared to life, a deafening, visceral sound that instantly filled the small space with the smell of gasoline and palpable dread. As the unsuspecting teenagers rounded the final corner, Tom, in full blood-splattered maniac regalia, leaped out, the fully fanged running chainsaw held high. The teens screamed and scattered. a perfect, chaotic explosion of fear. But in his enthusiastic, adrenaline-fueled lunge, his heavy work boot slipped on a patch of wet, decaying leaves that had been tracked into the garage. He lost his balance, his feet sliding out from under him. He fell forward, the full weight of his body coming down on top of the still roaring machine. The laws of physics and mechanics are indifferent to artistic intention. His obsessive quest for ultimate realism had delivered a final, brutally authentic performance. He had set out to create the scariest haunted house in the neighborhood, and in his final, tragic act, he had succeeded in a way he had never, ever intended. 4. In the fiercely competitive arena of Halloween costume contests, a young man named Alex was determined to win. He wasn't interested in a participation trophy. He was aiming for legendary status. His chosen costume was a classic, the Grim Reaper. But Alex was a purist, an artist who was offended by the cheap, plastic props sold at party stores. He believed that the power of a costume lay in its authenticity. The flimsy, bendable scythe that came with his robe was, in his opinion, an insult to the very concept of death. He needed an upgrade. His quest for realism led him to his grandfather's old, dusty barn, a treasure trove of forgotten agricultural implements. There, hanging on a wall, he found it. A real, antique scythe. Its long, curved blade rusted but still terrifyingly sharp. To Alex, this wasn't a dangerous farm tool. It was the perfect accessory, the missing piece of his masterpiece. He spent the afternoon carefully detaching the heavy, razor-sharp blade and affixing it to the long black staff of his costume prop. The result was a terrifyingly authentic and lethally dangerous piece of cosplay. He arrived at the packed Halloween party, his upgraded scythe resting on his shoulder. And he was an instant sensation. People marveled at the realism, the sheer audacity of his prop. He was the center of attention, a dark, menacing figure gliding through the crowded room. He was a shoo-in to win the contest. Fueled by the praise and a few cups of spiked punch, his confidence soared. He decided it was time for some action shots, some dynamic poses for social media. He began to swing the heavy scythe in slow, menacing arcs, the sharp steel blade whistling softly through the air, much to the nervous delight of the onlookers. It was during one of these dramatic, sweeping motions, as he was attempting to impress a group of friends with a particularly intimidating pose, that his night of triumph took a sharp, fatal turn. He stepped back for better framing, and his boot caught on the edge of a thick Persian rug. He stumbled, his balance completely gone. The laws of momentum and gravity, which are indifferent to costume contests, took over. He fell forward, and the heavy, lethally sharp scythe, which was still in his hand, swung down with him. He didn't just drop it, he fell onto it. The very tool he had chosen to represent death had, in a final, brutal act of authenticity, delivered it. His obsessive quest for the perfect, most realistic costume had been a spectacular success. But the prize was not a cheap plastic trophy. It was a one-way ticket to the underworld he had so skillfully emulated. 5. The eerie, moonlit atmosphere of an old, historic graveyard holds a powerful, gothic allure, especially for teenagers on Halloween night. For a group of friends, a young woman named Chloe and her companions, it was the perfect, edgy backdrop for a spooky social media photo shoot. They saw the crumbling, ivy-covered tombstones not as solemn memorials to the dead, but as rustic, atmospheric props. Armed with their smartphones and a sense of youthful invincibility, they wandered among the graves, striking dramatic poses and laughing at their own morbid creativity. Chloe, the most daring and ambitious of the group, was determined to get the ultimate shot. A photo so epic, it would be the talk of their school for weeks. Her eyes fell upon a particularly magnificent, if decrepit, monument. A tall, ornate, 19th-century granite headstone, a massive, 8-foot-tall Celtic cross that had been weathered by a century of wind and rain. It was tilted at a precarious angle, its foundation weakened by time and shifting soil. To her friends, it looked unstable, dangerous. To Chloe, it looked like the perfect climbing frame for her masterpiece. "I'm going to climb it," she announced, her voice filled with a giddy, reckless excitement. Her friends, a mix of impressed and terrified, tried to talk her out of it, but she was already on her way. She began to scale the old monument, using the ornate carvings as handholds. The stone was cold and slick with evening dew. She was surprisingly agile, and in a minute, she was perched near the top, a triumphant silhouette against the full moon. She struck a dramatic, vampiric pose for the cameras below, a queen of the damned in her own Gothic kingdom. But the 800-pound slab of granite, which had stood in a delicate, precarious balance for decades, had finally met a force it could not withstand. Her weight, combined with the shifting of her position as she posed, was the final, fatal straw. With a deep, grinding groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself, the massive headstone's foundation gave way. It didn't just crumble, it toppled, a slow-motion avalanche of solid rock. Chloe had no time to react. The monument fell, bringing her down with it and crashing to the ground with the force of a falling car, pinning her beneath its immense, unforgiving weight. Her quest for the perfect, epic photograph had been a stunning success, but the final tragic shot was not the one she had intended to capture. She had come to the graveyard to play among the dead, and in a final, brutal act of irony, the dead had decided to keep her. 6. Halloween parties are a theater of manufactured scares, a place where fake monsters and playful pranks are the main event. At one such party, a young man named Jake, a notorious prankster, decided he was going to pull off the ultimate jump scare. His chosen prop was a heavy, ornate, and very real-looking prop coffin that the host had rented for atmosphere. Jake's plan was simple. He would hide inside, wait for the perfect, unsuspecting group of friends to pass by, and then burst out, a resurrected corpse in a torrent of screams and laughter. To make the prank even more authentic, he decided he wanted to be locked inside. He found a heavy, old-fashioned metal padlock and, with a mischievous grin, he handed it to his best friend Mark. "Lock me in," he said. "It'll be hilarious. Don't worry, I've got the key right here." He jangled a small key in his hand to prove it. Mark, already several drinks into the evening and always a willing accomplice to Jake's stupid ideas, laughed and agreed. Jake climbed into the surprisingly spacious coffin and pulled the heavy lid down. He heard the satisfyingly solid clank of the padlock engaging. The darkness inside was absolute, the air thick and musty. It was perfect. His friends, however, had the attention span of drunken gnats. Mark, after performing his duty, was immediately distracted by someone starting a round of beer pong and wandered off into another room, the key to the prank now, a forgotten piece of metal in his pocket. The key Jake had so confidently brandished? It turned out to be for his own apartment door, a fact he discovered with a dawning, sickening sense of dread when he tried to unlock the coffin from the inside. Panic began to set in. He started to push against the lid, to yell, but his screams were just muffled thumps against the thick wood, completely inaudible over the party's loud music. His friends, if they heard anything at all, probably assumed it was just part of the haunted house sound effects. The coffin, a cheap but effective prop, was also surprisingly airtight. As the hours passed and the party raged on outside his tiny dark prison, the oxygen level inside began to plummet. His frantic struggles gave way to a desperate, silent blackness. The party eventually wound down, his friends laughing and stumbling out into the night, completely forgetting about the brilliant prank their friend was still performing in the living room. Jake had wanted to stage a fake resurrection, a hilarious jump scare to be retold for years. Instead, he had succeeded in staging a very real, very permanent burial, a final, fatal prank in which he was the only victim. 7. In the annual suburban arms race that is Halloween decorating, a man named George was less of an artist and more of a shock-and-awe tactician. His philosophy was simple: more is more. While his neighbors were tastefully arranging a few pumpkins and a skeleton, George was waging a full-scale war on subtlety. This year, his chosen weapon was light. He envisioned his house not just decorated, but transformed into a pulsating, retina-searing beacon of pure, unadulterated Halloween spirit. To achieve this on his characteristically tight budget, he bypassed the reputable hardware stores and ordered a massive, suspiciously cheap bulk shipment of orange and purple string lights from an anonymous online seller. When they arrived in a crumpled, unlabeled cardboard box, a sane person might have noted the flimsy, paper-thin wiring and the brittle, barely there insulation as major red flags. George, however, saw only a spectacular bargain. He spent an entire weekend in a feverish state of creative energy, wrapping every conceivable surface of his house. His masterpiece, the focal point of his electrical opus, was the front porch. He meticulously and tightly wound dozens of strands of the cheap lights around the cold, wrought iron railings, creating what he imagined to be a brilliant, glowing cage of festive cheer. On Halloween night, his house was a triumph, a gaudy, glorious monument to his vision, visible from 3 blocks away. As the evening wore on and trick-or-treaters marveled at his display, a light, drizzling rain began to fall. The water, a perfect and indiscriminate conductor, began to seep into the microscopic cracks and shoddy seals of the cheap, poorly made insulation on the light strings. The entire wrought iron railing, which George had so artfully covered, became silently, invisibly, and lethally electrified, a 240-volt death trap disguised as a holiday decoration. George, warm and dry inside, oblivious to the silent danger he had constructed, heard a faint, rhythmic flickering sound from the porch. Annoyed that a flaw had appeared in his perfect creation, he went to investigate. He stepped out onto the damp porch, the thin soles of his house slippers providing virtually no insulation from the now conductive, wet concrete. To get a better look at the offending bulb, he did what any homeowner would instinctively do. He reached out and grabbed the metal railing for balance and support. The moment his hand made contact, the full, unimpeded force of the household current found its new, most efficient path to ground. His body completed the circuit. The massive electrical shock stopped his heart instantly. He had wanted his house to be the most shocking on the street, a display so dazzling it would stop people in their tracks. In a final, tragic, and deeply ironic twist, he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but he was the only one who received the full, fatal effect of his own electrifying creation. The lights on his porch continued to flicker rhythmically over his silent form, a garish, buzzing epitaph for a man who had valued a bargain over his own life. 8. The corn maze is a beloved rite of autumn, a wholesome, family-friendly activity where the goal is to get playfully, temporarily lost. But for a man named Derek, who had entered a massive multi-acre, haunted corn maze with his friends just after sunset, the playful part of the experience had long since evaporated. His friends, with a better sense of direction or just dumb luck, had found their way out an hour ago. Their mocking text messages, "Did you pack a lunch?" and "See you at Thanksgiving," were a constant glowing reminder of his own navigational failure. The night had grown genuinely cold. The moon was swallowed by thick clouds, and every rustle of the tall, dry corn stalks now sounded less like ambience and more like a threat. He was a rat in a labyrinth designed by a sadistic farmer, and his patience had run out. He was done playing by the maze's rules. He looked up, and through a small gap in the corn, he could see the distant, comforting glow of the parking lot lights. A straight line, he reasoned with the unshakable logic of a frustrated man, is always the shortest distance between 2 points. He was going to beat the system. With a grunt of determination that was part frustration and part rebellion, he plunged off the designated dirt path and began to bull his way through the dense, seemingly endless rows of corn, his eyes locked on the distant lights, his internal compass his only guide. He was no longer a lost tourist. He was a trailblazer, a rugged individualist forging his own path. What Derek's city-bred mind failed to comprehend was that a working farm is an industrial landscape, filled with hidden infrastructure. He didn't know that this particular farm used a network of deep, narrow, and completely unlit irrigation ditches to water its vast fields. These ditches, often several feet deep with steep, muddy sides, ran silently between the rows of corn, a hidden system of traps for the unwary. As he confidently shoved his way through another wall of corn, his lead foot, which he expected to land on solid ground, found only empty black air. He tumbled headfirst into the cold, dark, and surprisingly deep ditch. The fall stunned him, and the landing in a foot of thick, icy mud knocked the wind out of him, the impact sharp and absolute. The ditch was too narrow to easily climb out of, its earthen walls slick with mud and impossibly crumbly. His brilliant shortcut had instantly become a cold, dark, and inescapable prison. His triumphant, straight-line path to freedom had led him to a hidden trench, far from the winding designated paths where anyone might eventually find him. His friends, assuming he had finally found his way out and caught a ride home, simply left. Derek had set out to prove he was smarter than the maze, but all he had managed to prove was that sometimes the long, winding, designated path is there for a very, very good reason. 9. The piñata is a centerpiece of joyous, chaotic celebration. A suspended treasure chest of candy, just waiting for the right amount of controlled violence to unleash its sweet bounty. At a particularly wild and crowded Halloween party, the main event was about to begin. The breaking of a massive pumpkin-shaped piñata. A young man named Kevin, his confidence inflated by several hours of festive drinking, was chosen as the first contestant. He was blindfolded, handed a heavy wooden bat, spun around until he was hopelessly dizzy, and pointed in the general direction of the swinging target. The game began. The crowd cheered and jeered as Kevin swung wildly, his powerful but clumsy efforts connecting with nothing but empty air. Standing on the edge of the cheering circle was his friend, a guy named Mike. Mike, also several drinks in, was a man of action, not patience. He watched Kevin's pathetic, flailing attempts with a growing sense of frustration. He didn't want to wait. He wanted the candy, and he wanted it now. As Kevin took another mighty off-balance swing, the bat finally made contact, grazing the side of the piñata and creating a small tear. A few tantalizing pieces of candy trickled to the floor. To Mike's intoxicated and deeply competitive brain, this was not a minor event. It was the starting gun. He was not going to wait for the piñata to be properly broken by the slow, inefficient, blindfolded guy with the bat. He was going to get a head start. In a moment of pure, candy-driven greed, he decided to dash in and scoop up the first fruits of the harvest. He's blindfolded, he likely reasoned with flawless drunken logic. I'll be in and out before he even knows I'm there. He sprinted from the safety of the circle, diving headfirst towards the base of the swinging pumpkin, his eyes locked on the sweet prize. Kevin, meanwhile, feeling the slight impact and hearing the sudden surge in the crowd's excitement, assumed he was on the verge of total victory. He gathered all his remaining strength for one final, glorious, home run swing. He was not aiming for a specific spot. He was aiming for the sound, swinging the heavy wooden bat in a wide, horizontal, head-level arc with all his might. He was completely unaware that his best friend's head had just entered the strike zone. The bat, which had so comically missed the piñata on all its previous attempts, made a perfect, sickeningly solid, and brutally accurate connection, not with papier-mâché, but with Mike's skull. The cheering of the crowd instantly curdled into horrified screams. Mike's impatient, greedy dash to be the first to the candy had succeeded only in making him the first, and only, casualty of the game. 10. For a man named Gary, a last-minute Halloween costume was not an opportunity for creativity, but a challenge in extreme resourcefulness and profound cheapness. With a party just hours away and his costume options limited to guy who forgot it was Halloween, he had a stroke of what he considered to be brilliant, cost-effective genius. He was going to be a mummy. His primary construction material, a 12-pack of the cheapest single-ply, store-brand toilet paper he could find. He spent the next hour in front of his bathroom mirror, diligently and somewhat pathetically wrapping himself from head to toe in the flimsy white paper. The result was, to be generous, underwhelming. The paper was so thin it kept tearing, and it clung to him in all the wrong places. He looked less like a fearsome, resurrected pharaoh, and more like a victim of a very unfortunate industrial accident involving paper towels. He needed something to hold his creation together, to give it some structural integrity and a more professional finish. His eyes fell on a large, economy-sized aerosol can of extra stronghold hairspray. Perfect, he probably thought. It's a clear, fast-drying adhesive. He proceeded to douse his entire toilet paper-clad body in a thick, generous, and highly flammable cloud of aerosol propellant and lacquer. The hairspray did, in fact, make his costume more rigid and held the loose ends in place. It also effectively turned him into a walking, talking, human-shaped tinderbox. He arrived at the party, immensely proud of his ingenuity. His costume was a hit, a perfect conversation starter about the virtues of frugality. Later in the evening, he made his way to the snack table, which was festively decorated with a row of hand-carved jack-o'-lanterns, each one lit from within by the warm, flickering glow of a real tea light candle. As he leaned over to grab a handful of cheese puffs, the loose trailing end of one of his toilet paper wrappings, now stiffened with and saturated by a powerful, flammable accelerant, dipped for a split second into the open flame of the nearest pumpkin. The ignition was not slow. It was instantaneous and violent. The hairspray-soaked paper didn't just burn, it erupted. In a horrifying whoosh that silenced the party, his entire costume was engulfed in flames. He had spent his evening dressed as a creature risen from a tomb, and in a final, fiery act of tragic irony, he had managed to turn himself into a human funeral pyre, a cautionary tale about the very real dangers of combining cheap materials, flammable accelerants, and an open flame. All right, I need a final verdict in the comments. I want you to be the judge. Out of all 10 stories tonight, which death was the absolute least dignified? Which one would be the most embarrassing story for your ghost to have to tell for all eternity? Name your winner. If you're thankful your own ghost story isn't written yet, obliterate that like button and subscribe for more.